Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is about how to detect and mitigate guardrail violations with AWS Control Tower. Before we get started, let me introduce you to our team. My name is Ana Paula Murphy, and I'm here with Navaz Duraraj and Brian Miller. We are senior business developers for AWS Control Tower and Service Catalog. Before we jump into the guardrails, we'll provide you a high-level overview of AWS Control Tower, give you a high-level understanding of what you get when you deploy AWS Control Tower. Then we do a deep dive into 3 specific guardrails with a small demo of how you can actually identify a non-compliance issue and address it and get notified for it. We'll close with questions and answers, and we'll give you additional resources on how to find additional information about guardrails and Control Tower. But let's talk about what our clients are looking for, right? Basically tell us that they want to be able to focus on the core of their business as opposed to having to choose between business agility and governance control. But the reality of the migration to the cloud is when they start that journey to the cloud and they start to take advantage of everything that the cloud has to offer, such as going global very quickly, the elasticity of expanding and shrinking and only paying for what you're using, the cost savings associated with not having to have on-prem equipment, and just being more agile and innovate fast. When the clients start to see all these benefits of moving to the cloud, more and more teams want to jump in. So there are additional projects, additional departments, additional resources and teams, and the environment tends to grow and become more complex. So with that, AWS Control Tower was born. AWS Control Tower is a new service that offers the easiest way for organizations to set up and govern their AWS environment at scale. With AWS Control Tower, customers can enable, provision, and operate their environment for both business agility and governance at scale. But how does that really work, right? It sounds great, but what do you get when you deploy AWS Control Tower? So let's take a quick look at the automated AWS landing zone, which is a great feature of AWS Control Tower. So a landing zone is a well-architectured multi-account AWS environment. And when you're deploying AWS Control Tower, it basically takes advantage of all the learnings and the best practices of compliance and security to deploy this pre-configured, secure, and scalable multi-account environment based on these best practice blueprints. And you recognize a lot of the services that are listed here because they all also work individually and separate. But AWS Control Tower brings them together. So you have the multi-account management using AWS organizations, the identity and federated access management using AWS single sign-on, the centralized logging using AWS CloudTrail and AWS Config. The cross-account audit access is through AWS single sign-on and AWS IAM. There's also the end-user account provisioning through AWS Service Catalog, and the centralized monitoring notifications using Amazon CloudWatch and Amazon SNS. So a lot of different components that are brought together through AWS Control Tower. When you finish the deployment of AWS Control Tower, you also notice that some accounts have been pre-configured for you. There are 2 OUs, the core and the custom. Under the core OU, there's the log account, this account works as a repository for logs and of API activities and resource configurations from all accounts in the landing zone. And then there is the audit account, and this account is for the teams of users that need access to the audit information made available by AWS Control Tower. You can also use this account as an access point for third-party tools that will perform pragmatic auditing of your environment to help your audit and compliance purposes. So then, of course, you're left with the custom OU where you will configure your accounts and based on your organizational needs. So in a nutshell, what you get with AWS Control Tower. So you get this automated landing zone set up based on our best practices. You have the centralized identity and access manager. AWS single sign-on is utilized behind the scenes here. And you can control the SSO access and the user permissions across all of the AWS accounts and organizations within AWS Control Tower. Then you have the automated compliant account provisioning. So one of the benefits of Control Tower is facilitating the account provisioning process. It uses service catalog behind the scenes to ensure that all the new accounts are deployed with the right policies in place. So these are pre-approved and pre-configured options that are attached to these accounts so that when they are deployed through the Account Factory, they are already set up the way that you want them to. So all of that is, we have the policies and the rules that govern all of this access through the guardrails. The guardrails are a high-level set of rules that provides ongoing governance for your overall AWS environment. And that's where we spend most of our time here today. We'll do a deep dive into the guardrails. So ultimately, what we're looking for is not only to enable and deploy the environment, but also to continuously manage the environment. And so we have a dashboard that makes it really easy for us to be able to see what is happening. The dashboard offers continuous oversight of your landing zone and your teams of central cloud administrators. So you use the dashboard to see provisioned accounts across the enterprise, guardrails that are enabled for policy enforcement, guardrails that are enabled for continuous detection in non-conformance, and non-compliance resources organized by accounts and also by OUs. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Navaz. Navaz, if you would take us through additional details on how the guardrails work and maybe talk a little bit about best practices around the guardrails.
Of course, Anna. Happy to explain the concept of guardrails. We will start with the definition of a guardrail. The basic definition of a guardrail is a high-level rule that provides governance for your AWS environment on an ongoing basis. The AWS Control Tower guardrails have two main behaviors, detective and preventive. The preventive guardrails are implemented using service control policies and are part of AWS organizations. These guardrails ensure that your accounts maintain compliance. The detective guardrails are implemented using AWS Config rules. These guardrails detect non-compliance of resources within your accounts. Unlike SCPs, which are applied at the account level, the AWS Config rules only apply on supported regions for Control Tower. Now, AWS Control Tower provides three types of guardrails: mandatory, strongly recommended, and elective. When you first set up AWS Control Tower, you would have noticed that the mandatory guardrails are enforced by default. These include enabling access logging for the log archive account, disallowing configuration changes to CloudTrail, disallow changes to IAM roles set up by AWS Control Tower. As you can see, these guardrails prevent drift and maintain the state of the AWS Control Tower environment. The strongly recommended guardrails are based on best practices for well-architected multi-account environments. Examples of this include enabling MFA for the root user. This is also an AWS Trusted Advisor check. The elective guardrails enable an organization to lock down commonly restricted actions in an AWS enterprise environment. Disallowing access to IAM users without MFA is a detective guardrail with elective guidance. You can see more examples of guardrails on this slide. The question often comes up, when should you apply elective or the strongly recommended guardrails? Your policies are going to be less restrictive in a development environment versus a production environment. For example, a production environment will be locked down to only the subset of services being used in an application. In a development environment, developers may have access to most services. A second example is regulations. If you have to meet certain kinds of regulations, HIPAA, HITRUST, PCI compliance, or GDPR, you may consider preventing cross-regional replication. This is another guardrail that you can apply. A third consideration is workloads. If you're going to be running RDS in a certain environment, you probably want to apply the guardrail which disallows public access to Amazon RDS database instances. You may have more ideas on when to apply a guardrail. At the end of the day, your approach to guardrail applications will depend on the situation and the use case you're trying to solve. To the Control Tower dashboard. This is the initial screen that you're presented with. Clicking on the Organizational Units tab, you'll note that I have 3 OUs that were created by Control Tower. So these are the default OUs: Core, Custom, and Root. The root is simply the parent container for all accounts and all other OUs in your landing zone. Going back and clicking on accounts, you'll notice that I have 4 accounts. 3 are default, and 1 is an account that I provisioned with Account Factory in AWS Service Catalog. I created the development account in the custom OU. Note that the dashboard provides a summary of the environment, 2 organizational units, 4 accounts, and we also have a summary of the guardrails that are applied in this environment: 17 preventive guardrails and 3 detective guardrails. We will be enabling 3 guardrails on the custom OU for the development account. We will apply each guardrail and then trigger them so you get to see how Control Tower identifies non-compliance. If we take a look at the development account, you will notice that it has no non-compliant resources. How do we go about adding extra guardrails to this account? Note that the existing guardrails that are already enabled on this account are mandatory and are related to audit, monitoring, and the Control Tower setup. If I click on the Guardrails tab, you can see that we have a list of all available guardrails that we can apply to the account. Note the different categories that are available. We also have a few in operations, data security, and IAM. Don't forget to click onto the second page. We have some extra guardrails here. The guardrail that we are going to be applying is disallow EBS volumes that are unattached to an EC2 instance. This is a strongly recommended guardrail, falls under the operations category, and is an AWS Config rule. Clicking on the guardrail, note that it's written in plain English, making it quite easy for anybody to understand what it does. If you'd like to take a look at the code, you can also do so by simply clicking on AWS Config rule, where you can see how this guardrail was put together. This means you can copy the code and create your very own AWS Config rule. This is useful if you would like to customize it or add your own similar guardrail in a region that's not supported by Control Tower. Let's go ahead and enable this guardrail. And we're going to go ahead and do it on the custom OU because that's where my development account lies. And now, this will take a few minutes as the guardrail gets enabled. So when would you deviate from this guardrail? There are a few occasions where you would, and this includes, for example, when you're swapping out volumes between instances. That's when you would likely ignore the non-compliance. Or maybe you're simply restoring an EBS volume from an EBS snapshot so you can recover files or folders. In that case, you're going to have an unattached EBS volume for a little bit of time. Alright, we're going to go ahead and validate the Guardrail EBS volumes are detached from an EC2 instance. I'm going to go ahead and log in as an end user who has access to launch Service Catalog products. This is the AWS SSO login page, and I'll type in my password. Hopefully I have this right. Don't save. And as you can see here, I'm going to be taking on the permission set of the AWS Service Catalog end user access. Selecting Service Catalog. I had already provided this user the permissions to launch a few different products, EC2 instances plus a SageMaker notebook. And in this case, we're simply going to launch an EC2 instance. I'm going to select a VPC with a private subnet, and we're going to let everyone access this instance, although it is in a private subnet. Right, and we click launch. Once a test instance is available, it will show up over here. Since this will take a few minutes, we're going to come back to this. Alright, our instance is now launched. With the instance launched, I'm now going to forcibly detach the EBS volume from the instance. And let's go back to the EC2 dashboard. We have one running instance, and this was an instance that was created by Service Catalog. I'm going to go ahead and stop this instance. Certain organizations may not have given me access to the EC2 services and products dashboard, but this is a test, so it's fine. And I'm also not worried about the impact to any running workloads on this instance. Let's go back to 0 running instances, great. And let's go ahead and detach this volume. Alright, while this is taking place, I'm now going to go back and log in as the Control Tower administrator to view the dashboard. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and log in as the Control Tower administrator for my environment. Don't save. Logging into the master account. I'm also going to go ahead and add Control Tower to my dashboard, so I'll just make it simpler for me to click into it. And as I scroll down, I immediately see that Control Tower has highlighted my non-compliant resources, and you can see the exact resource or volume ID that was detached from my EC2 instance in the development account. The guardrail that triggered was disallow EBS volumes that are unattached to an EC2 instance. And if you click further into the development account, you will see the same information presented to you, as well as the enabled guardrails that are specific to this account. Okay, we will take a look at a second guardrail, disallow internet connections through SSH. Clicking on the Guardrails tab, we can find this guardrail on the second page, right here. This is a strongly recommended guardrail, and it falls under the network category. As you can see, it's already identified a non-compliant resource ID, a security group. I did have this enabled on the development account, which is underneath the custom OU. You may be scratching your head on this one because you may think, isn't it sometimes important to access your server? Maybe you have to consult the system logs or debug application issues. So I agree. However, there are better and more secure ways to connect. You can use a Bastion host or Amazon EC2 Instance Connect, which helps with short-lived keys and better auditability. The other option is to use Session Manager for shell access to EC2 instances, and this uses SSM agent on EC2 instances. We'll now go back and log into the development account to see and verify that it actually picked up the proper security group. Okay, we're going to log into the development account to validate why Control Tower considered that particular security group to be non-compliant. Clicking onto the EC2 dashboard, on the left we'll find Network and Security. And clicking onto Security Group, we find the list of security groups. The security group that is highlighted was what Control Tower considered non-compliant. As you can see, the description is enable SSH access to Linux EC2 instances. Looking at the inbound rule, we do see that its port 22 is wide open. With our two guardrails fired up and signaling that the development account is non-compliant, I now apply our third guardrail. Disallow S3 buckets that are not version enabled. We can find this guardrail on the second page. It's actually versioning enabled. You can see that this is an elective guardrail. If you're not storing critical data or one copy is more than enough, you probably do not want to enable this guardrail on your account. Maybe you're using something like GitHub or Code Commit to track your versioning data sets. So let's enable this guardrail on the OU. And this will take a few minutes. The guardrail enabled. We'll now take a look at the non-compliant resources, and we will notice that this guardrail has identified an S3 bucket which does not have versioning enabled. It looks like I've been using this bucket to store CloudFormation templates. So I'm going to go ahead and log into my development account and enable versioning on this account bucket, and then we'll confirm that Control Tower no longer identifies this as a non-compliant resource. Logging into the development account, I'll select administrative access, which will give me access to the S3 buckets. And I see the bucket here, so I'm gonna go ahead and click on properties, and if I click on versioning, I'll notice that it does not have any versioning on this particular bucket. So let's go ahead and enable it. Click save. In the development account, I'm also going to go ahead and attach the EBS volume back to the EC2 instance and change the security group so it no longer allows SSH access over the internet. We have this volume. I'll click attach volume, and there's only one instance. I'll click attach. So hopefully this takes care of the guardrail that's looking for EBS volumes that are not attached. And then within security groups, taking a look at this security group, it does have SSH port 22 open, and I'm going to go ahead and close. I'm actually removing all access to this instance. Click save. Alright, that should take care of the guardrail. And now we'll go ahead and log out from this account. We're now back in the master account for AWS Control Tower. We'll take a look at the Control Tower dashboard. And as you can see, after we made the edits in the development account, attaching the EBS volume, changing the security group, and enabling versioning on the S3 bucket, we no longer have any non-compliant resources. All of the accounts are now in compliance, including the development account. Hope this session was useful on how we apply guardrails, view non-compliant resources on the Control Tower dashboard, and how the remediation process works.
Thank you, Navaz. We talk a lot about guardrails, but it's great to see how it actually works in action. So in summary, what we covered in this webinar was a high-level overview of AWS Control Tower and some of its features, such as the automated landing zone, the built-in identity and access management, account factory for account provisioning, and we spent most of the time going over the guardrails for policy management. Navaz gave you an overview of AWS Control Tower dashboard. He covered best practices as it relates to guardrail applicability, and he selected 3 guardrails to dive into. He purposely made a change that caused the environment to be non-compliant, and you were able to see how AWS Control Tower dashboard displayed exactly which account was non-compliant with which guardrail. And it was nice and easy to see what the issue was because it's displayed in plain English. So that's what we intended to cover in this webinar, but I do want to leave you with some additional resources. So here are some great links about AWS Control Tower that you have access to, and you will get this deck after this presentation. So you'll be able to go to the main page and see how to deploy AWS Control Tower. You will also have access to the user guide. And I have selected 3 great blogs about AWS Control Tower that I highly recommend that you take a look at. And there are a few others that you can find on the internet, but these 3 are some of my favorites. So I'd like to thank you for your time and spending this time going over AWS Control Tower with us. And now I'd like to turn it over to you and find out if you have any questions. Thank you.